Okay, is it time to say goodbye to yesterday? Or is it time to say goodbye to the GH5? So it's the summer of 2020. We're mid-COVID. I don't know, maybe we're in the beginning of COVID. We're still deep in the pandemic here in the United States with no end in sight. But let's not talk about that. Let's talk about cameras. Micro Four Thirds, man. Is there a place for Micro Four Thirds anymore? Just to clarify, I'm talking about mirrorless hybrid cameras. So cameras that can shoot both photos and video. I feel like the distinction is important for content creators, in particular for people who are self-employed, running their own businesses, because the ability to take photos is a very important aspect for people who are out there trying to hustle. Now, before S1H, Micro Four Thirds had a lot of advantages. And after S1H, pretty much all those advantages, if not all of those advantages, are now shared by the bigger sensor cameras, or at least the S1H. The main advantages were really high quality professional codecs. So you had 422 10-bit internally, you had 4K 60 internally, albeit at 8-bit 420, with the ability to shoot 4K 60 externally at 422 10-bit. You have just a really professional feature set for video shooters. You have dual SD card slots with the ability to do relay recording and hot swap. So that's really helpful for professional shooters, people who are doing event work, or anything that just needs a long record time. There's a full-size HDMI, none of this micro or mini HDMI business. It's just a stronger cable, less likely to break. They've got waveforms, they have vector scopes in the camera. Panasonic has an audio adapter that just slots into the hot shoe of the GH5, GH5S, and also the S1H. And this allows you to have two XLR inputs into the camera, as well as provide 48-volt phantom power if needed. So you get, essentially professional grade audio directly in the camera with no need to sync. Just makes post-work flow a lot easier and quicker. Well, just quicker, not necessarily easier, a little bit easier. Now this one, isn't so important. For some people it might be important, for others it might not really matter, but there's anamorphic shooting modes in the camera. So that means that there's an open gate 4:3 aspect ratio possibility, which gives you the ability to use 2x or 1.8 times anamorphic lenses. And there's a de-squeeze function, so you can monitor the anamorphic footage right in the camera without need of an external monitor. No record limits. So like I referenced before with certain types of shooters who just need to let the camera run for more than 30 minutes without cutting, these cameras allow you to just record indefinitely as long as it has power and media. Battery life is pretty decent. These are still running on the same batteries as the older GH camera, like at least the GH4, but it still works for at least 2 hours, I would say, using constant 4K recording, at least 4K 30 or 4K 24. No overheating. Now I'm sure that there is some scenario in which you can get the Micro Four Thirds cameras to overheat, but I would say in just about any real world scenario, I've never really heard of anybody having overheating issues with the Micro Four Thirds cameras. Should you be thinking about selling your GH5, your GH5S, or whatever other Micro Four Thirds camera you might be using for video shooting, and trying to get one of the bigger sensor cameras like the S1H or maybe the A7S III, because the S1H in particular, like I said, does all of these things that I just mentioned that the GH5 can do. The S1H is Netflix certified. So what that means is if you buy an S1H, you automatically get a contract to make content for Netflix. So it's pretty important that you buy an S1H. Now, sensor size. What the fuck is the deal with sensor size? YouTube, if you listen to a lot of YouTubers talk about full frame cameras like it's the second coming of Jesus, it's really not. Full frame field of view wasn't really a thing for making movies prior to the 5D Mark II. In the history of cinema, you typically had the majority of films shot on Super 35mm film, which is essentially the size of an APS-C camera sensor, with the occasional bigger film stock like 65mm, 70mm, but those were much more expensive. They take bigger projectors that not a lot of theaters have, so they weren't utilized anywhere near as much as just your standard Super 35mm. Digital cameras basically followed suit and had Super 35mm sensor sizes. They are starting to make and become more prevalent bigger formats like full frame, like 35mm full frame, like on a A7S III or S1H, but also bigger sensors. So you've got the Aries 65, which is basically two sensors stacked together. Yes, it is becoming more prevalent to have larger format cameras in movies, but it's not like you can go back and watch movies from like 1940 up until 2010, and probably 90% or greater were shot on Super 35. They looked awesome. You know, nobody was really complaining. There's also a lot of movies shot on Super 16, which is essentially the same sensor size as a pocket cinema camera, the original, not the 4K. It's overblown. It's overrated. Your imagery, your productions, your whatever it is you're doing is not going to be immediately better just because you go with a bigger sensor. Yes, there are advantages. The biggest advantage is it's easier to go wide. You have more access to wide-angle lenses. You can shoot wide-angle with probably shallower depth of field than you can with a smaller sensor camera. You have better low-light performance. You don't have to push the ISO as much as you do with a smaller camera to get the same exposure. So you probably do have the ability to shoot in less than optimal conditions with cleaner results. People all talk about like the shallow depth of field. Look at movies. There's not usually an extremely shallow depth of field in movies. You know, there's usually, yeah, the background is probably less in focus than the foreground, but it's not like it's a blur of color. You can usually see what it is, even though if it's a little bit out of focus. You don't have like this razor thin depth of field in the vast majority of movies and TV shows. TV shows probably have more shallow depth of field. That's because they don't have the budgets as the same budget for production design, for location scouting. There are a lot of times reusing locations, so the ability to blur the background out means that you can reuse the location because you can't tell that it's the same location as of a different scene. So yeah, TV maybe has the propensity to use shallower depth of field than movies, but there's like a real legitimate reason for doing that. It's not just because it looks cool. For video work, focus is critical. Having the subject in focus is like 100% the most important thing for the camera operator or the focus puller to do. Focusing with a big sensor in a really shallow depth of field is extremely hard. It can be hard to even tell if you're not quite 100% in focus, especially if things are moving a little bit. And we're not really to the point, as amazing as some of the autofocus systems are on the Sony cameras and the Canon cameras in particular, I don't think a lot of people are to the point where they're going to be shooting movies with autofocus. You know, for other video production, yeah, you can use autofocus for interviews, you can use autofocus for moving subjects. There's a lot of good applications for autofocus. I have not reached the limits of the GH5S in terms of what it can do. It's not the limiting factor. I have a lot to learn about lighting, about composition, about colors. All these other things have more to do with how the video looks than the camera itself. We're looking at a $1,700 camera right now. The GH5 regular is about $1,200. Tack on $100 if you want the Vlog upgrade, so $1,300. As opposed to the full frame cameras, the S1H is $4,000. The Sony a7S III is $3,500. What is it that you're gaining by going with those bigger cameras? The bigger sensor cameras. Low light performance, shallower depth of field, the ability to shoot wide with a shallower depth of field. That's pretty much it. And then if you can say, yeah, my production would really benefit from those three things, then go for it. So the other thing too I want to quickly touch on is just, I feel like we always get inundated. If you spend any time on YouTube, which if you're watching this video you probably do, always inundated with new shit, you know, new cameras, new gear, there's always new stuff. We always see all this content. So on whatever day it was earlier this, or I guess at the end of July, Sony made its official announcement of the a7S III, and then right at the same time, YouTube was flooded with content creators with pre-production models of the a7S III. And it was pretty exciting. Like, it finally did everything that the older Sony Alpha cameras didn't do. So it's great. I'm not knocking YouTubers for making those videos. They do provide a valuable service. They are mostly, you know, objectively honest reviews of the camera's capabilities, what it does, what it doesn't do. They are providing information. So if you're like me, you're probably going to do a lot of research before you buy any particular gear, whether it's cameras, lenses, lights, whatever. And YouTube is a component of that research. and it's extremely valuable. There's a lot of really knowledgeable content creators on YouTube. So that's important. But there's another component to it that you should keep in mind, and that's marketing. Even if they are unbiased, even if they don't have any restriction about what they can say, even if they're provided the camera with no expectation that what they say will be positive, the companies are still giving out or lending equipment for these content creators to make content with. The companies know that this is, in some respects, free marketing for them, because it's just flooded YouTube, flooded social media with all of this content about this particular piece of gear. Even if some of it's negative, or negative in certain aspects, we're still seeing all of this content. We're still seeing Sony a7S III, we're still seeing Canon R5, Canon R6. Being good consumers like we are, we're conditioned to see all this marketing, to see all this content, and want to get the newest thing. You know, it's just how it works. You know, when you see, you know, why do you want a new car? Does your old car not work? Yeah, it still works, but you want a new one because it's new and it has features that your old car doesn't have, and it makes you happy to buy it temporarily. But then now it's an old car. Just like your old car was an old car, your new car is now a used car. Just like your new camera, it's no longer new, it's yours, it's used, and the shine wears off quickly. Yeah, there's still a place for Micro Four Thirds. Is there a future for Micro Four Thirds? No, that's another question. So I'd like to hear from you guys. What do you think about full frame versus Micro Four Thirds, or full frame versus APS-C? Are you hung up on it? I feel like it's, yeah, I think it's trending towards full frame. Even movies are. But I do think that directors and cinematographers at that level are much more critical and savvy about what it means to shoot on different sensor sizes. They don't reflexively go for a bigger sensor just because they think it's better by virtue of it being bigger. Anyway, let me know what you guys think. What are you shooting on? What are you excited about? Are any of you guys out there thinking, man, I really need to get the Sony a7S III, or heaven forbid, the Canon R5 or R6, Fujifilm X-T4? What cameras are you excited about, and why? What is it about them? I'm more interested to know why you're making the choices that you're making. I guess that's it. Thanks for watching this video. Give it a like if you liked it, dislike it if you thought it was the worst thing you've ever seen. If you don't like my face, if you don't like my horrible beard, yeah, whatever it is you disliked about it, doesn't matter. And subscribe if you want to. It doesn't affect you, but it helps me, and it helps Google, which is important. And yeah, thanks for watching this video, and see you in another one.